Today's word is déjà vu, the memory phenomenon of feeling as though one has lived through the present situation before. I lost a social media friend today, blocked, consumed by the toxic pandemic sweeping the planet right now. TDS, the Trump derangement syndrome that affects people in different ways, mostly arising from outraged powerlessness in the face of the Nazi coup and its associated atrocities. All of us expressing opinions to each other have evolved a new and profoundly meaningful relationship with the lie. And the right to lie, believing the truth is what we choose to believe, inflexibly. No opinion that doesn't align perfectly with our own narrow prejudice has any value. We become competitive opinionators in which being right is the essential requirement for civil discourse. Heaven forfend you don't agree 100% with my version of truth. So long as we keep repeating the same opinion we present as our own truth, even when the premise is not reliable, erring to the side of untruth, that lie repeated often enough will become the truth. In a society whose majority are educated to mirror-repeat authority figures, watching Trump repeat this sorry formula stolen from the Goebbels handbook, where the lie is the equal of the truth, models and then normalizes the lie. This is the primary cause of TDS, the normalized lie in which Donald Trump is the genius, democratically elected, best-in-class leader of the most powerful nation on earth, whose executive orders enjoy the approval of almost half Americans polled by Gallup last week. The truth of what Donald Trump represents in the context of racist, fascist, Nazi dictatorship, destroying all legal institutions, humanity has evolved to protect the rights of the majority from men like Donald Trump, is not popular in the way the lies are, and so the liars have it. The truth, according to Gallup, is that almost 1 in 2 Americans you meet approve of Donald Trump and his Nazi golden era of grift by oligarchy, stealing from the poorest to make the richest richer still. But do almost 50% of Americans identify as mass child murderers who approve of endless Nazi genocide by the Zionist administration, whose ideology continues its right to exist only by the constant and endless blood of children, consumed in its culture of moral turpitude? Do almost 1 in 2 Americans approve of their new identity as a Zionist enclave in the Greater Israel? If you were to ask anyone in that 47% about their solidarity with Nazi genocide, in my opinion, informed by people I've met and spoken with, they would not understand why. They are conditioned to block out the nasty truth and keep repeating the convenient lie, just as their training in mirror-repeat education and blind faith religion prepares them for. If Jesus said so, then it must be true. I think there is a component element of dumbness underpinning this 47% who appear as pro-genocide and proud of it. At least I hope that's the case, that they are simply that dumbed down by a century of propagandized methods. Surely they do not really identify as premeditated mass child murderers knowingly. I hope it is an unconscious bias that makes them support mass child murder on an industrial scale. Almost 1 in 2 Americans approve of what Trump represents. Almost half of America responding to a Gallup poll on approval. In plain English, Trump is a functionally illiterate serial liar, a convicted felon, a sex offender who sold signed Bibles to pay for his hooker bills to a family values base. A serial bankrupt whose entire career is littered with business partners who lost everything in the art of his deal, that is, the art of the steal. an outspoken racist and a textbook fascist ideologue who speaks for the Zionist right to genocide indefinitely in a model of Nazi authoritarian rule that operates no differently from any previous fascist Nazi iteration of a blitzkrieg first militarized government of we the racist white rich few, for you the racist poor white ignorant people. Waging a war on the poor, the likes of which we have never seen in the annals of government regulation, applying legal checks and boundaries on profit at any cost monopolistic capitalism. Trump and his clan of Christian fascist Zionist grifters, the CFZG, are not the first administration to lie their way to election in so-called democratic process by deceiving a dumbed-down majority. Promises made, promises kept, their manifest destiny to extort as much wealth for the chosen few from the poorest many as they are able to do. By deregulating all oversight on irresponsible capitalist excess, by ending all legal oversight on mass murder criminality on an industrial scale, by replacing the notion that there are inalienable human rights enshrined in a constitution for the home of the brave and the land of the free, with a revised version of freedom in which only Donald and friends are free to end all freedom, by creating a climate of fear among the 50% of Americans who do not approve of their new designation as an illegal terrorist state free from United Nations human rights oversight, who openly mass murder children with willful premeditation, by accusing others of that they are guilty of and repeating their lies until the dumbed-down majority, the 47% who approve, agree. Not everyone is on board the Trump train, buying Donald crypto to become get-rich-quick billionaires, Trump style. Donald has enemies, as you would expect. It was the same for Benito Mussolini and for Adolf Hitler. Fascism tends to divide every electorate in which fascism was chosen by a majority. Donald's enemy is the 50% of Americans that Gallup says do not approve of Trump's chosen few manifest destiny. This is numerically the majority of Americans who do not support the Trump gang's methods that include grifting from the poorest to enrich only the very richest, free from any objection, either by the emasculated, delegitimized legal system operated by the new breed of Trump-loyal criminals as lawmakers, or by the leading opinion shapers, the smartest and most literate, who historically have raised the alarm when a real and present danger threatens the safety of the nation. This group of the most intelligent and credible, who are a vital sector in a healthy society, are now marginalized by a dark age culture of algorithmically led banning orders. Notably absent in this Trump iteration of Nazi right hegemony is the emergence of a leader voice around whom the 50% who expect that mass child slaughter should be illegal can find common purpose. A voice to unify the majority, pointing the way out of the thrall of Nazi Christian psychobabble in which mass murdering children is perfectly legal if the president says it is. A representative for the civil and human rights that were at one time the foundational pillars of the United States of America that at least 50% of Americans would like to see returned. A sensible leader who does not lie with every utterance in the manner all Trumpers do, like a Martin Luther King or a Nelson Mandela, a credible voice supporting basic human values, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we once understood as inalienable rights that are now alien to all, but the oligarchs' inalienable right to turn billions into trillions. There are many articulate voices speaking up for the oppressed victims of this Christian Nazi blitzkrieg on the poorest. Their influence is insignificant. The squeaky wheel gets the oil. The guy with the most followers is the squeakiest wheel. The big influence complex, the top 10 most followed influencers, control a total following of more than 4 billion people. When you consider that this number represents 50% of the global population, and that 50% of the global population are mired in generational poverty, excluding them from following any opinion other than where the next meal will come from, then it's safe to say any one of these top 10 big influencers like Trump, the supreme criminal leader with 47% approval, and South African Musk with his 200 million bought and paid for followers squeak louder than the top million most informed commentators on the rise of the Nazi right, as well as what happens next. The part the big influencers don't mention to their 47% pro-genocide followers. How does Nazi genocide end for the followers? After the last child is dead and the dust settles on those foreign shores. Why did that Welsh Manic Street preacher say, "If you tolerate this, then your children will be next"? I was born in South Africa. My opinions are influenced by my formative education in the South African state system, a curriculum formulated by the Nazi-era apartheid government to indoctrinate an entire generation into a specific ideology, similar to fellow South African-born Elon Musk. Watching Elon represent that formative education we enjoyed as privileged whites in the apartheid era, the sense of déjà vu is astonishing, reminding me daily that I've been in this position before, feeling horrified seeing the evil that lying men do once absolute power has corrupted absolutely. The first time was when I first saw Nazi oppression target protesting voices as a teenager in South Africa. That wasn't the last time either, although that is a different story you will probably thank me for saving. When I grew up, Facebook jail had an equivalent for those offending community standards. It was called BOSS, the Bureau of State Security. Goons would come for dissidents, usually after being grassed up by conservative informants at 3 a.m. Speaking out against the right for white men to kill black children with impunity and militarized legal protection could mean death. A bunch of goons show up at 3 a.m. and take the victim to John Forster Square, where many were tortured to death under terrorism laws. More importantly than the small number actually arrested was that everyone knew what would happen if you spoke out against the white racist Nazi right, much as we see now, where almost 50% of Americans would rather identify as mass child murderers than speak out against it. Ex unitate vires, from unity strength, is a Latin phrase formerly used as the national motto of South Africa, the mantra of the apartheid system I was raised in. We learned early on that anyone threatening national unity by dissent deserved the most draconian punishment reserved for traitors of this type. There are a few lessons my education in the apartheid-era state schooling system provided that I can share with you now. We learned what happened to leaders who spoke out against the administration. Protest and die, stay silent and enjoy white privilege. In a comparable example with where we are today, where 1 in 2 Americans stand by indefensible corruption, when I was a teenager becoming politically aware, I saw the reaction to my observations of right and wrong no differently than what I see today. As I said, déjà vu. Back then, the racist white fascist Christian administration operated the identical conservative ideology that we see in the USA today. The narrative in which the patriot's duty was to obey the president's dictate unquestioningly and unflinchingly prospered by the brutal persecution of any dissident view. If you grew up in 70s South Africa attending a state school, as I didn't agree that apartheid was God's will in which it was ordained, blacks were a lesser race whose manifest destiny it was to obey the chosen few, the white masters, then you were on a slippery slope to incarceration in administrative detention as a terrorist. This was not a general guide to how to be a good South African. It was a pain of death direction. This society had no tolerance for any alternate views. Christian conservative compliance to the supreme leader's party, or else. The or else then was the same as the or else today. At least for me and my sense of déjà vu, that is the case. When I was 17, I arrived at Wits University Medical School in Johannesburg. Wits was the most liberal university in South Africa, being possibly the only place where some freedom to speak without fear of summary arrest existed. It was the first time I could meet and exchange ideas with people who were not entirely under the cosh of the racist white administration. I knew all too well by then that the government was deviant and wrong, that the schooling was deviant and wrong and intended only to groom buzz-cut rugby-playing, rifle-hunting, born-again Christian Nazis for service in the war for the fatherland's white right. It was obvious to me from very early on that the enormous forces of propaganda were massed against me, and that if I spoke out, sharing the awareness I knew all too well to be both the truth and the counter-narrative to the Nazi administration's right to continue in their Nazified version of Christian racism, I would face enormous and life-threatening consequences. My opportunities to protest Nazi government then were very different to those available to young people today, or old people for that matter. As a very brief aside, my first act of political protest growing up in a racist apartheid Christian militarized society happened when I was around 7. It took the form of refusing to learn Afrikaans. I made the association between the language and the ideology it represented. Unpleasant. Of my own volition and without any influence other than the anti-Nazi ideology I learned young from my anti-Nazi father, who confronted Nazism in World War II for 6 years, I decided to refuse to participate in Afrikaans lessons. At that time in the South African schooling system, no matter how many straight A's you achieved, unless you passed English and Afrikaans at year end, you failed the year. Information that tested my determination to stand by the consequences of an ideological commitment, and that taught me an important lesson in the legality of Nazi administration making up Nazi rules to dominate and subjugate through education. Although I never submitted any Afrikaans paper at exam time, I would write, "I don't understand," in English at the top of each paper. Mysteriously, I passed every year. Often, the bluff of the Nazi is to claim a legal validation for their illegal nonsense, although, of course, often they do follow through with their threats, which is why we have the word blitzkrieg today. During my first week as a medical student at Wits, our group of privileged white boys in line for a medical degree had a guest lecturer. A working doctor, Neil Aggett, arrived to provide a most memorable occasion in which we, our group of about 100 first-year medical students, were most receptive to learning at this Institute of Higher Learning. Here was a top doctor at the top of his explaining game. Dr. Aggett, 26 at that time, spoke to us for an hour or so. For the first time, I heard an adult South African speak honestly, articulately, and compellingly about the iniquitous and unsustainable nature of rule by a chosen few on the basis of a God-given privilege in which their racist right to kill designated inferiors at will was enshrined in law, with indemnifying protections for the killers, with deadly consequences for anyone protesting this right. Aggett was working at a black hospital, Baragwanath, if my memory serves, where he said he saw black workers with common injuries from factory work. This led him to examine the cause and not the symptoms. That process led him to help black folk, who were mostly illiterate, to form a workers' union, to improve safety, and possibly, I assume with hindsight, be in a position to negotiate a fair wage for their labor in a legal system in which black workers had the same rights as slaves. I thought all this talk was terrific. Here was a grown man walking the walk and talking the talk, a lucky man to have sailed through his medical degree and was now able to impact on society in a meaningful way that was so obviously for the good, as apartheid Nazism was so obviously for the bad. After that talk, I waited for an opportunity and spent 10 minutes chatting with Neil Aggett. My question was, aren't you afraid to speak out like this? Won't the security police come after you? His answer, paraphrased only somewhat, if you are empowered by opportunity to make a difference against the tyranny of evil men and you stay silent because you are afraid, then you are complicit in what happens next. Always do the right thing when you know what the right thing is. That chat ended with a warm handshake and a really impressed young Andrew thinking, my goodness, he is martyring himself in full awareness that telling the truth is going to kill him. And he's doing that for free, when he could just open a private practice in Bryanston and become a millionaire instead. That year was 1978. I never saw Neil Aggett again. In 1982, I learned what had happened. It didn't take the boss agents long to place him in administrative detention at John Forster Square, little more than 3 years after his talk to the first years at Wits. Aggett and his partner, Dr. Elizabeth Floyd, were seized by boss agents on November 27, 1981. His death came on February 5, 1982, following 70 days of detention without trial, in which you can bet he was brutally tortured daily. His was the 51st death in detention by the apartheid regime. Aggett was 28 years old. Those interested in the Zionist Epstein's death in detention years later, in 2019, will be interested to learn that the apartheid administration claimed that Aggett had committed suicide by hanging himself while being held at the infamous John Forster Square police station. They often claimed victims of their torture who died killed themselves, which makes sense when you understand moral turpitude. At that time, 1982, I had a gig in a music venue in Braamfontein that required driving past John Forster Square. On every occasion, I felt chilled to the bone by that sight of that building. The joke then was, be careful you don't get hit by a falling body. It was widely known that prisoners slipped on soap in the shower and fell 10 stories onto the concrete below. Growing up in this climate of conservative right-wing Christian oppression affected my outlook on how I would protect myself from coming to the attention of these people while still developing my freedom of thought, balancing the need to do the right thing with the value of not getting caught. John Forster Square, an early version of Guantanamo Bay, was named after the former apartheid-era Prime Minister John Forster, a Nazi leader for a Nazi party. In 1939, at the outbreak of World War II, instead of going to fight against Nazi fascism like my father did, Forster dedicated himself to the pro-Nazi organization, the Ossewa Brandwacht, rising to the rank of general, ending up in Nazi jail from 1942 to 1944. During apartheid, John Forster Square was where they took you if you spoke out against the Christian right to white supremacy, where you could expect interrogation, torture, and abuse by the South African Security Police under the Internal Security Act, where, if you were suspected of being an enemy of the state, by, for example, questioning whether Jesus actually existed, or talking to a black girl in a flirtatious way, then a type of government employee employed for their blind allegiance to Nazi ideology was empowered to summarily arrest you and cart you off to John Forster Square. Legally, detention without trial. I learned early on during my student years in South Africa that the very last thing you wanted to happen was to be picked up at 3 a.m. by boss agents and taken to John Forster Square. This could easily be avoided by saying nothing about Nazism, never mentioning the word apartheid as anything but a nationalist duty, and singing the Lord's Prayer in full voice every morning at assembly. By bullying the population into silently accepting the legality of apartheid, snatching protesters in the middle of the night and often killing them after prolonged periods of horrible Israeli-level torture, the government were able to cultivate a climate of fear so real that obedience was systemic. If, for example, you were caught with a copy of a banned book like, for example, Anna Sewell's Black Beauty, a book about a horse that had an illegal colouring experiencing good and bad masters, then an observant snitch might report you to the boss, and soon after you would be transported at 3 a.m. to the 10th floor of John Forster Square, being shouted at in Afrikaans. Voices against Nazism then had to be careful. Authoritarian rulers operate a close watch on dissent. At that time, my options for freedom of speech were limited to aspiring to move to America, where I knew they had a constitution in which freedom of speech defined the American experience. At that time of learning about freedom and why I wanted some of it, the USA was where it was happening. I located a copy of the US Constitution, and that was the most exciting book I'd read in ages. I don't know if it was on the banned list by the South African Census Board. Probably it was. Freedom of speech and fascist authoritarianism can never coexist. While I was in South Africa, before I was able to emigrate to England, I lived with the constant awareness that someone might know my thoughts and pass this information on to the security police. This was not at all comparable to the experience of Facebook jail that so upsets so many at this time, when people wonder about freedom of speech and the freedom to be heard. And so, here's the point of this post about my déjà vu. Living in a Nazi racist tyranny in which there was no freedom of speech and no right to protest injustice, in a society with no rule of law protecting any civil rights, demanding only blind submission to a Nazi ideology on pain of death, is no fun. By that I mean, it really is not something you ever want to try at home. A message I tried sharing with my American friends in the 2024 election, when I saw 2/3 of Americans lining up to vote for Zionist apartheid in the lesser of two evils election for a Zionist leader. I was disappointed to see 99% vote for apartheid fascism, preparing to attack those who gave warning on how that works out for the majority, rather than listening to those who knew in all certainty what a pro-apartheid, pro-genocide authoritarian party bring to the table. Not because of any great gift with prophecy or mystical foresight or political science degree, but simply because apartheid fascism has clearly defined markers. Anyone who has lived through a fascist regime knows how predictable the stages are. I left apartheid South Africa at the first opportunity, as did many of my generation, in what was called a brain drain. The apartheid regime, like any fascist authority led by deviant non-thinkers corrupted by the limitations of fascism, persecuted the most thoughtful, who might influence others away from the rule of law in which God said blacks were inferior to the chosen few whites, even going so far as to give them a piece from the Bible to validate their claim. That apartheid system I left behind was a fascist autocracy in which Nazi ideology ended all freedoms and legal protections for civil rights. That's how fascist autocracy works. You can call it by any name that suits your level of education or indoctrination, but here's the bottom line. If it speaks like a Nazi, legislates like a Nazi, pays to kill children like a Nazi, genocides like a Nazi, steals from the poor like a Nazi, lies like a Nazi, looks like a Nazi, sig heils like a Nazi, thanks God like a Nazi, and salutes flags like a Nazi, the chances are 47% of Americans who approve of Nazi government are Nazi, whether by unconscious bias or otherwise. Unconscious Nazi bias by a dumbed-down, propagandized majority seduced by the most efficient big influence complex in the history of malign old men paying ideologically ambiguous binary coders to manipulate opinions for dollars. Right-leaning conservatives drawn to fascism who love the opportunities that come with being one of the chosen few. The Nazi many, not knowing the cost of freedom they traded for their great white hope for a more lucrative genocide, who believe their inalienable right to repeat an opinion entitles them to have an equally valuable opinion as those whose opinion is not pro-Nazi. In South Africa, when I used to have this conversation with Nazis, most commonly they would absolutely refute that they were Nazis. They would typically become quite angry. There was no way you could convince them that mass killing another group designated as inferior was either wrong or illegal. They followed a herd narrative indistinguishable from the current iteration in which 47% of people who stand by their right to mass murder children can't all be wrong. While I do understand that approximately half of my fellow Americans have as much right to an opinion as me, and that approximately half do not see Nazi genocide as a bad thing for as long as they refute being active participants in a genocide that will not end for as long as they keep believing in their right to vote Zionist, I do not agree that mass killing children is reconcilable with their Christian faith. It's the hypocrisy that bothers me as much as the delusion. In my opinion, you can't be both a Nazi for genocide who approves of the leader sending billions to fund the killing of millions, as well as a certified, heaven-assured believer that Jesus Christ is the Son of God who offers salvation and eternal abundance in a Garden of Eden heaven for all who identify as self-certified Christians. In reality, we're expected to believe that 47% of Americans knowingly approve of Nazi genocide, the vast majority of whom identify as Christians. It's not plausible that this 47% don't know about the genocide. To suggest they are so stupid they believe that what we have seen unfolding before and after October 7 is not genocide will likely get you in deep trouble with community standards for suggesting any American could be that stupid. Almost 1 in every 2 Americans is an extraordinary number to be operating heavy machinery and driving at the same time as holding these Stone Age beliefs. In the early 1960s, the Yale University psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted his Milgram experiment, in which it appeared that 80% of people will obediently obey an authority figure who instructed them to perform acts conflicting with their personal conscience. Milgram said, "The essence of obedience consists in the fact that a person comes to view themselves as the instrument for carrying out another person's wishes, and they therefore no longer see themselves as responsible for their actions. Once this critical shift of viewpoint has occurred in the person, all of the essential features of obedience follow. In reaction to a bullying authoritarian figure, obedience appears to be the reaction of the majority who are affected by fear in this way." Milgram's experiment suggests only 20% of Americans are capable of critical thinking, placing their own beliefs above the orders of the authoritarian figurehead they are conditioned to follow blindly. A natural bully aptitude with access to a fascist ideology, unencumbered by any ethical constraints to his greed, willing to lie without ever facing accountability, knows that some 80% of his electorate will not fight back. This is not a schoolyard bully slapping the geek for fun. This is a sinister entity who has used his victory over the now supplicant American people to dismantle all that made America great. This is what free fall into the abyss looks like. And so, while the wait goes on for that leader figure able to unify the worker majority en masse to point the way back to constitutional law that begins with rounding up and jailing those who ended it, I'm reminded of another déjà vu memory that I paraphrase for an upbeat end to this somewhat gloomy post. Americans will eventually do the right thing once all other possibilities have been exhausted.